The year is 1965, and America finds itself standing at a crossroads in a small country most Americans cannot even locate on a map. Vietnam, a place of rice paddies and jungle, of ancient temples and modern ambitions, has become the proving ground for American military might in the Cold War era. What happens next will become one of the most controversial and ultimately futile military campaigns in American history. Over the next 3.5 years, American aircraft will drop more than 860,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam alone. To put that in perspective, during all of World War II, American forces dropped approximately 2 million tons of bombs across all theaters, both Europe and the Pacific combined. In just one country, in just one sustained campaign, America will unleash nearly half the explosive power it used to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The campaign has a name that sounds almost casual, almost routine: Operation Rolling Thunder. But there is nothing routine about what is about to unfold. This is the story of how the most powerful nation on Earth, armed with the most advanced military technology ever created, waged a bombing campaign of unprecedented intensity and still walked away defeated. This is the story of hubris, of miscalculation, of the limits of air power, and of a small nation that refused to break. To understand Operation Rolling Thunder, we need to understand the world of 1965. The Cold War is at its height. America sees itself as the guardian of freedom, locked in an existential struggle against communist expansion. The domino theory dominates thinking in Washington. If South Vietnam falls to communism, then Laos will fall, then Cambodia, then Thailand, then perhaps all of Southeast Asia. President Lyndon Johnson, who inherited the Vietnam problem from John F. Kennedy after the assassination in 1963, finds himself trapped. He desperately wants to focus on his domestic agenda, the great society programs that will define his legacy at home. But he cannot afford to be the president who lost Vietnam to communism. The political cost would be devastating. Republicans would crucify him. The right wing would accuse him of being soft on communism. His entire domestic agenda would collapse under the weight of foreign policy failure. So Johnson and his advisors begin searching for a middle path, a way to support South Vietnam without committing to a full-scale war, without mobilizing the American public for total conflict. They settle on air power. Bombing seems like the perfect solution. It demonstrates American resolve. It punishes North Vietnam for supporting the communist insurgency in the South. It can be calibrated, turned up or down depending on North Vietnamese behavior. And most importantly, it does not require massive numbers of American ground troops, at least not initially. The logic seems sound. North Vietnam is a poor, agricultural society. It has limited industry. Surely sustained bombing will force them to negotiate, will compel them to stop supporting the Viet Cong insurgents in South Vietnam. How long can a backward country withstand the fury of American air power? The bombing campaign begins in March 1965, but its roots go back further. In August 1964, there was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where North Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly attacked American destroyers. The incident, later proven to be greatly exaggerated and partly fabricated, gives Johnson the congressional authorization he needs. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passes with only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate. It gives the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. This blank check will haunt America for the next decade. Initially, the bombing is presented as retaliation for for specific Viet Cong attacks on American facilities in South Vietnam. In February 1965, Viet Cong guerrillas attacked the American airbase at Pleiku, killing 8 Americans and wounding more than 100. Johnson orders retaliatory strikes called Flaming Dart. Then there is another attack, another round of strikes called Flaming Dart 2. But these tit-for-tat retaliations soon evolve into something much larger, much more systematic. On March 2, 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder officially begins. What starts as a limited campaign will become a sustained aerial assault that continues for 3 years, 8 months, and 17 days. The rules of engagement for Rolling Thunder are complex, maddeningly so for the pilots who fly the missions. This is not World War II, where entire cities can be leveled. This is not even Korea, where commanders have broad latitude. Johnson and his civilian advisors, particularly Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, maintain tight control from Washington. They personally approve target lists. They designate restricted zones where bombing is prohibited. The goal is graduated pressure, a term that sounds scientific, almost clinical. The idea is to slowly increase the pain on North Vietnam, giving them opportunities to negotiate, to back down, to stop supporting the communist insurgency in the south. Start with targets in the southern part of North Vietnam, then gradually move north. Start with military targets, then expand to infrastructure. Always leave Hanoi and the Red River Delta relatively untouched, at least initially, to show restraint, to leave North Vietnam room to de-escalate. This strategy of gradualism proves to be fundamentally flawed. Instead of shocking North Vietnam into submission, it gives them time to adapt, to prepare, to build defenses. Every restricted zone becomes a sanctuary where supplies and troops can gather. Every bombing pause, and there are many as Johnson repeatedly halts the bombing to signal willingness to negotiate, gives North Vietnam time to repair damage and strengthen defenses. The North Vietnamese are not intimidated by graduated pressure. They see it as weakness, as proof that America lacks the will for total war. The aircraft doing the bombing come from 2 sources. The Air Force operates from bases in Thailand and South Vietnam, flying F-105 Thunder Chiefs, known as Thuds, and later F-4 Phantoms. The Navy operates from aircraft carriers in the South China Sea, flying A-4 Skyhawks, A-6 Intruders, and their own F-4 Phantoms. The rivalry between Air Force and Navy is intense. They fly different missions, use different tactics, compete for target allocations. This inter-service rivalry sometimes hinders coordination and effectiveness. Air Force pilots complain that Navy flyers get easier targets. Navy pilots grumble that the Air Force gets more glory. Meanwhile, young men on both sides are dying in flaming aircraft over the jungles of North Vietnam. The F-105 Thunder Chief becomes the workhorse of Rolling Thunder. It is a massive aircraft, a supersonic fighter bomber designed to deliver nuclear weapons into the Soviet heartland at low altitude and high speed. In Vietnam, it carries conventional bombs instead, lots of them. A fully loaded Thud can carry up to 14,000 pounds of ordnance, more than a World War II B-17 flying fortress. But the F-105 is not designed for the kind of missions it flies in Vietnam. It is too big, too heavy for dogfighting with nimble MiG fighters. It is vulnerable to ground fire and surface-to-air missiles. The loss rate is devastating. By the end of Rolling Thunder, 382 F-105s have been lost in combat, nearly half of all the Thunder Chiefs ever built. Some squadrons lose aircraft at a rate that would exhaust the entire force within months, if not for constant replacements. The missions follow a pattern. Pilots wake before dawn. They attend briefings where intelligence officers outline the target, known defenses, potential threats. The targets vary. One day it might be a bridge, the next a railroad yard, then a power plant, a petroleum storage facility, a truck park, a barracks. The target folders show reconnaissance photos, detailed maps, anti-aircraft positions. Then comes the arming and pre-flight. Bombs are loaded, fuel tanks filled, weapons systems checked. The pilots suit up in G-suits and survival vests, packed with everything they might need if shot down: radios, flares, a pistol, water, medical supplies, and gold coins to bribe villagers. Takeoff is always tense. A heavily loaded fighter bomber uses every foot of runway. Then comes the flight north, usually in formation, sometimes dozens of aircraft heading to the same target area. As they cross into North Vietnam, the air becomes hostile. Radar warning receivers begin chirping, then screaming as enemy radars lock on. The pilots watch for surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, rising from the jungle on pillars of flame. They watch for muzzle flashes from anti-aircraft guns. They watch the sky for MiG fighters. Everything happens fast at 500 miles per hour. The flak over North Vietnam is intense, sometimes the heaviest any American pilots have faced since World War II. The North Vietnamese have thousands of anti-aircraft guns, ranging from small-caliber machine guns to massive 85 and 100 cannon that can reach high altitude. The guns are placed everywhere, around bridges, near power plants, along roads, in rice paddies. They fire proximity-fused shells that explode near aircraft, shredding them with shrapnel. Pilots describe flying through flak as like flying through a thunderstorm made of steel. The sky fills with black puffs, each one a deadly explosion. Sometimes the flak is so thick that pilots cannot see through it. Then there are the SAMs, the Soviet-made SA-2 surface-to-air missiles. These weapons change everything. They force aircraft to fly low where they are more vulnerable to small arms fire and light flak. When a SAM launches, pilots have perhaps 30 seconds to react. The missile accelerates to 3 times the speed of sound. It homes in on the aircraft using radar guidance. The standard evasion is to dive toward the missile, then brake hard, pulling maximum GS, trying to make the missile overshoot. This works sometimes it does not. A SAM explosion near an aircraft is catastrophic. The warhead contains hundreds of pounds of high explosive surrounded by steel rods. The blast and shrapnel shred aircraft. Many pilots never know what hits them. And then there are the MiGs, North Vietnamese fighters flown by pilots trained by the Soviets and Chinese. The MiG-17 is subsonic but highly maneuverable. The MiG-21 is supersonic, fast, armed with air-to-air missiles and cannon. North Vietnamese pilots use hit-and-run tactics. They wait for American strike aircraft to be at their most vulnerable during the bomb run when pilots are focused on the target, flying straight and level. Then the MiGs pounce, fire their weapons, and dive away before American escort fighters can respond. The North Vietnamese are outnumbered and outgunned, but they are fighting over their own territory. Damaged MiGs can land at nearby bases. Pilots who eject are quickly rescued. American pilots who go down face capture and years in brutal POW camps. The losses mount steadily. Every day, aircraft do not return. Some explode in midair. Some spiral into the jungle trailing smoke and flame. Some simply disappear, they're one moment and gone the next, leaving only a brief radio call and then silence. The loss rate is sustainable in raw numbers. America has plenty of aircraft, plenty of pilots, but each loss represents a human tragedy, a family destroyed, a future erased. Some pilots are killed instantly. Some eject and are captured, spending years as prisoners of war, subjected to torture and deprivation. Some are never found, their fate unknown, their families left to wonder. The targets that Rolling Thunder strikes are chosen based on a philosophy that proves tragically flawed. McNamara and his whiz kids, the systems analysis experts from Rand Corporation and academia, believe they can scientifically calculate the pain threshold of North Vietnam. They identify target sets, transportation infrastructure to disrupt the flow of supplies south, industrial facilities to damage North Vietnam's limited war-making capacity, power plants to reduce electricity generation, petroleum storage to limit fuel supplies. Each target is assigned a value, a number representing its importance to the North Vietnamese war effort. The theory is that by destroying enough high-value targets, by inflicting enough economic damage, North Vietnam will be compelled to negotiate. This theory ignores several crucial realities. First, North Vietnam is not an industrialized society dependent on complex infrastructure. It is largely agricultural. Most people live in villages without electricity. They farm rice using water buffalo and hand tools. Destroying a power plant in Hanoi does not affect a farmer in the countryside. Second, North Vietnam does not need a sophisticated economy to support its war effort. China and the Soviet Union supply most of the war material. Weapons, ammunition, fuel, trucks, even food aid flows across the northern border from China and arrives by ship at the port of Haiphong. As long as those supply lines remain open, and Johnson refuses to authorize bombing them for fear of provoking Chinese intervention, North Vietnam can sustain the war indefinitely. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the theory ignores the human factor, the will to resist. The North Vietnamese are fighting for their country on their own soil. They view the conflict as a continuation of their struggle for independence, first against the French, now against the Americans. They have already fought for nearly 20 years. They have already suffered tremendously. More bombing, even massively more bombing, will not break their will. If anything, it strengthens their resolve. Every bomb that falls is used for propaganda. Look at the American imperialists. The government tells its people, look at what they do to our schools, our hospitals, our homes. This is why we fight. This is why we cannot surrender. The bombing also has another unintended consequence. It rallies international opinion against America. Photos of bomb damage, of destroyed villages, of civilian casualties circulate worldwide. Anti-war movements grow in America and Europe. The Soviet Union and China increase their support to North Vietnam, supplying more weapons, more advisors, more aid. What is intended to isolate and punish North Vietnam instead isolates America diplomatically. Meanwhile, the supply route from North Vietnam to South Vietnam continues to function. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, actually a complex network of roads, paths and waterways running through Laos and Cambodia, keeps supplies and troops moving south. Thousands of porters carry supplies on bicycles and on their backs. Trucks drive at night with their headlights off. When roads are bombed, they are repaired within hours. When bridges are destroyed, pontoon bridges or underwater bridges are built. The North Vietnamese develop sophisticated camouflage techniques. They move during the monsoon season when clouds prevent aerial reconnaissance. They disperse supplies in small caches throughout the jungle. They become masters of adaptation and survival. The bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail becomes an obsession. Thousands of sorties are flown against the trail. Sensors are dropped into the jungle to detect truck movements. AC-130 gunships circle at night, using infrared sensors to find trucks and blast them with cannon fire. But the trail cannot be closed. For every truck destroyed, more trucks arrive from China and the Soviet Union. For every segment of road cratered by bombs, repair crews fill the craters. The North Vietnamese lose enormous amounts of material on the trail, but enough gets through. The insurgency in South Vietnam continues to grow stronger, not weaker. Back in Washington, the debate intensifies. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military commanders, want to escalate dramatically. They want to mine Haiphong harbor. They want to bomb the dikes that control flooding in the Red River Delta. They want to bomb downtown Hanoi. They want to invade North Vietnam with ground troops. They argue that the current strategy is doomed, that graduated pressure is allowing North Vietnam to adapt, that the only way to win is through overwhelming force. But Johnson refuses. He fears Chinese intervention, remembering what happened in Korea when American forces approached the Chinese border. He fears provoking the Soviet Union. He fears domestic backlash if casualties spike. So the bombing continues at its current level, intense but constrained, destructive but not decisive. The pilots and air crews bear the burden of these political decisions. They risk their lives attacking targets that are often of marginal military value. They watch their friends die for bridges that are repaired within days. They fly into the most heavily defended airspace in the world with one hand tied behind their backs by rules of engagement that seem designed to prolong the war rather than win it. Frustration and cynicism grow. Many pilots believe they could win if Washington would let them. Others begin to question whether the war is winnable at all. Life in the POW camps of North Vietnam is brutal beyond description. American prisoners are held in facilities like Hoa Lo Prison, which the prisoners sarcastically nickname the Hanoi Hilton. Conditions are medieval. Prisoners are kept in small cells, sometimes in irons. They are tortured routinely. The North Vietnamese want confessions, propaganda statements, denunciations of American policy. They use beatings, rope torture where the prisoners' arms are tied behind their backs so tightly that circulation is cut off and excruciating pain results, prolonged stress positions, solitary confinement for months or years. Some prisoners resist heroically. Others break and make statements they later regret. All suffer tremendously. The Geneva Conventions are ignored. Mail from home is withheld. Medical care is minimal. Disease is rampant. Some prisoners die from torture, neglect, or disease. Those who survive emerge years later as broken men who must rebuild their lives and psyches. The air war has its moments of success. Some targets are destroyed effectively. Some North Vietnamese capabilities are degraded. The interdiction campaign on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, while unable to close the trail, does force the North Vietnamese to devote enormous resources to keeping it open. Tens of thousands of workers spend their time repairing roads, building new routes, operating anti-aircraft defenses. This is manpower and material that cannot be used elsewhere. The bombing also provides a bargaining chip. When negotiations eventually happen, bombing pauses are used as incentives, resumptions as punishment. But these tactical successes cannot overcome the strategic failure at the heart of Rolling Thunder. The fundamental theory is wrong. Air power alone cannot win this war. It cannot break the will of a determined enemy fighting on home soil. It cannot close supply lines when sanctuaries exist across the border. It cannot substitute for a viable political solution in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government is corrupt, unpopular, unstable. It lacks legitimacy with its own people. No amount of American bombing of the North can fix the political rot in the South. As the months turn into years, the tonnage statistics become staggering. By the end of 1965, American aircraft have flown more than 55,000 sorties and dropped 33,000 tons of bombs. In 1966, the numbers jump to 148,000 sorties and 128,000 tons. In 1967, at the peak of rolling thunder, American aircraft fly 108,000 sorties and drop 226,000 tons. The scale is almost incomprehensible. On some days, more bombs are dropped on North Vietnam than were dropped on Germany on D-Day. The expenditure of ordnance is prodigious. Millions of bombs, from massive 2,000-pound general-purpose bombs to tiny cluster bomblets. Napalm that incinerates everything in its path. White phosphorus that burns with an intensity that cannot be extinguished with water. The cost in treasure is enormous. Each sortie costs tens of thousands of dollars in fuel, ordnance, maintenance, pilot time. Each aircraft lost represents millions of dollars in hardware, not to mention the incalculable cost of a trained pilot. By some estimates, Rolling Thunder costs America more than $900 million, equivalent to billions in today's currency. The economic cost to North Vietnam is also severe. Infrastructure is destroyed. Thousands of civilians are killed. The economy is disrupted. But North Vietnam can absorb these costs because China and the Soviet Union are willing to provide aid, and the population is willing to endure hardship. The racial dynamics of the air war are worth examining. The pilots and air crews are predominantly white. Many come from military families from the South and Midwest, from small towns and military academies. They have been raised on stories of World War II heroism. They believe in duty, honor, country. They trust their leaders. When they are told that Vietnam is important, that stopping communism is necessary, they believe it. But as the war drags on, as friends die for no apparent purpose, as the gap between official pronouncements and ground truth becomes impossible to ignore, disillusionment sets in. Some pilots become vocal critics after they leave the service. Others struggle silently with doubt and guilt. The technological aspect of Rolling Thunder is fascinating and tragic. America deploys some of its most advanced weapons. The AGM-45 Shrike missile, designed to home in on enemy radar emissions and destroy SAM sites. The AGM-62 Walleye, an early television-guided bomb. Sophisticated electronic countermeasures pods that jam enemy radar. Wild Weasel aircraft specifically designed to suppress enemy air defenses. Yet despite this technological superiority, the North Vietnamese adapt. They learn to turn off their radars to avoid anti-radiation missiles. They use optical aiming for their anti-aircraft guns. They study American tactics and develop counters. Technology provides an advantage, but not a decisive one. Weather plays a huge role. The monsoon season brings heavy clouds and rain that make visual bombing nearly impossible. Missions are cancelled or diverted. Bombs miss targets because pilots cannot see through the clouds. In 1967 alone, thousands of sorties are scrubbed due to weather. This gives North Vietnam predictable periods of respite where they can repair damage without fear of attack. The Americans try all-weather bombing using radar, but radar bombing is less accurate. A bridge that can be hit with precision using visual aiming becomes a much harder target when attacking through clouds using radar. Circular error probable, the radius within which half of bombs will land increases from dozens of feet to hundreds of feet. This means more bombs are needed to destroy a target and more collateral damage to surrounding areas. The question of civilian casualties is contentious and politically charged. American officials insist that Rolling Thunder targets only military and industrial targets, that great care is taken to avoid civilian areas. This is partly true. Compared to World War II area bombing campaigns that deliberately targeted cities to break civilian morale, Rolling Thunder is more discriminate, but precision is relative. A bomb aimed at a bridge can miss and hit a nearby village. A strike on a rail yard can cause secondary explosions that damage surrounding neighborhoods. Anti-aircraft fire that misses its target comes back down somewhere, often on civilian areas. And while downtown Hanoi and Haiphong are mostly off-limits, especially early in the campaign, suburbs and smaller cities are not. The North Vietnamese claim thousands of civilian deaths. American officials dispute the numbers, but cannot deny that civilians die. Each civilian death is a propaganda victory for North Vietnam and erodes support for the war internationally and at home. The bombing pauses are particularly interesting studies in political signaling gone wrong. Johnson orders several bombing halts, hoping to encourage negotiations. The first major pause comes in December 1965, lasting 37 days. Johnson makes a public peace offensive, sending emissaries around the world to explain America's reasonable terms for peace. North Vietnam responds by denouncing the pause as a trick and continuing to support the insurgency in the South. When bombing resumes in January 1966, Johnson is portrayed as the aggressor who refused peace. Similar patterns repeat with subsequent pauses. Each time, North Vietnam uses the pause to strengthen its position. Each time, resumption of bombing damages America's image. The pauses satisfy neither hawks who see them as signs of weakness nor doves who want permanent cessation. By late 1967, it becomes clear to many observers that Rolling Thunder is not working. The North Vietnamese show no signs of buckling. The flow of supplies to the south continues. The insurgency in South Vietnam grows stronger, not weaker. More and more American ground troops are deployed, reaching 500,000 men, far beyond what was envisioned when Rolling Thunder began. The war is becoming increasingly unpopular at home. Protests grow in size and intensity. Eugene McCarthy challenges Johnson for the Democratic nomination on an anti-war platform. The Tet Offensive in January 1968, a massive coordinated attack by communist forces across South Vietnam, shocks America. Though Tet is a military defeat for the communists, it is a psychological and political victory. It proves that after years of bombing, after hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives, the enemy is still capable of attacking anywhere in South Vietnam. After Tet, Johnson makes a momentous decision. On March 31, 1968, he addresses the nation. He announces a partial bombing halt. Strikes on North Vietnam will continue only in the area north of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone separating North and South. The rest of North Vietnam is now off limits. More shockingly, Johnson announces that he will not seek re-election. The war has destroyed his presidency. Rolling Thunder, which was supposed to be the solution, has become part of the problem. On November 1, 1968, just days before the presidential election, Johnson orders a complete halt to all bombing of North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder officially ends. It has lasted 3 years, 8 months, and 17 days. The statistical summary of Rolling Thunder is staggering. American aircraft flew 306,000 combat sorties. More than 860,000 tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam, not counting the additional tonnage dropped on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia. The Air Force lost 528 aircraft. The Navy lost 397. A total of 925 American aircraft were destroyed. Hundreds of airmen were killed. Hundreds more were captured and spent years as POWs. The cost was enormous in blood, treasure, and political capital. And what was achieved? North Vietnam's war-making capacity was damaged but not destroyed. The flow of supplies to the south was disrupted but not stopped. North Vietnamese morale was tested but not broken. The bombing may have delayed North Vietnam's conquest of the south, but it did not prevent it. In the end, in April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. South Vietnam collapsed. America evacuated in chaos from the roof of its embassy. Everything Rolling Thunder was supposed to prevent happened anyway. Why did Rolling Thunder fail? The answers are complex and multi-layered. First, there was a fundamental mismatch between objectives and methods. Airpower alone cannot win a war of insurgency. It cannot create political legitimacy for a corrupt government. It cannot substitute for effective ground operations and a coherent strategy. Second, the gradualism of the campaign was exactly wrong. It gave North Vietnam time to adapt rather than shocking them into submission. Every restricted zone, every target limitation, every bombing pause was seen not as restraint, but as weakness. Third, the theory behind Rolling Thunder misunderstood the nature of the enemy. North Vietnam was not Nazi Germany with a complex industrial economy that could be crippled by strategic bombing. It was a poor agricultural society that could absorb enormous punishment and continue fighting. The North Vietnamese were also deeply committed to their cause. They viewed the war as a struggle for national survival and reunification. No level of bombing short of genocide could break that will. Fourth, the constraints imposed by Washington tied the hands of military commanders. The most militarily significant targets, Haiphong Harbor, the irrigation dikes, the Chinese border area where supplies entered the country, were off-limits for political reasons. This meant that the source of North Vietnam's ability to wage war, the aid from China and the Soviet Union, could not be attacked. It was like trying to stop a flood while leaving the source of the water untouched. Fifth, Rolling Thunder diverted attention and resources from the real war in South Vietnam. While America focused on bombing the North, the insurgency in the South grew stronger. The Viet Cong recruited more fighters, controlled more territory, undermined the South Vietnamese government. The bombing of the North had minimal impact on the situation in the South because the insurgency was largely self-sustaining, drawing support from the population and from local resources, with North Vietnamese aid being supplementary rather than essential. Sixth, the air war over North Vietnam was fought under conditions that negated many of America's technological advantages. The dense air defenses forced aircraft to fly low and fast, reducing bombing accuracy. The restrictions on pursuing MiGs into Chinese airspace gave enemy fighters a sanctuary. The prohibition on attacking airfields where MiGs were based meant that American fighters had to meet MiGs in the air rather than destroying them on the ground. Every advantage given to the enemy made the campaign harder and costlier. Seventh, there was an intelligence failure. American planners consistently underestimated North Vietnamese resilience and overestimated the impact of bombing. They assumed that a poor agricultural society would quickly buckle under modern air power. They did not understand that poverty can be a strength in this kind of conflict. A society with little infrastructure cannot have its infrastructure destroyed. A population accustomed to hardship is harder to intimidate with more hardship. Eighth, the political management of the war from Washington created impossible conditions for success. Johnson and McNamara tried to micromanage the war from the White House, personally selecting targets, imposing rules of engagement, starting and stopping the bombing for political purposes. This might work for a short, sharp campaign, but for a sustained effort over years, it was disastrous. The military commanders on the scene had better understanding of tactical realities, but they were overruled by civilians thousands of miles away. The legacy of Rolling Thunder is profound and troubling. It demonstrated the limits of air power in certain types of conflicts. It showed that technology and firepower cannot substitute for a coherent strategy and clear political objectives. It revealed the dangers of graduated escalation and the perils of fighting a limited war for unlimited objectives. The lessons of Rolling Thunder influenced American military thinking for decades. In future conflicts, in Desert Storm, in Kosovo, in Afghanistan and Iraq, American military leaders tried to apply the lessons learned from Vietnam, use overwhelming force rather than gradualism, give field commanders freedom to act rather than micromanaging from Washington, define clear objectives and exit strategies. But whether these lessons have been truly learned remains debatable. For the Vietnamese people, North and South, the bombing was a tragedy. Thousands died, tens of thousands were injured. Cities and towns were damaged or destroyed. Infrastructure that took decades to build was obliterated in minutes. The psychological trauma lasted for generations. Unexploded ordnance, bombs that landed but did not detonate, continues to kill and maim Vietnamese civilians decades after the war ended. Children find bomblets that look like toys. Farmers plow fields and detonate buried bombs. The landscape itself became a weapon that continues to kill long after the war is over. For American veterans of the air war, the legacy is complex. Many are proud of their service, of their skill and courage, of the way they performed under incredibly difficult circumstances. They flew obsolescent aircraft into the most heavily defended airspace in history and somehow survived. They watched friends die and kept flying. They endured captivity and torture and came home. But many also wrestle with doubts. What was it for? Why did so many have to die? Could the war have been won if Washington had made different decisions, or was it doomed from the start? These questions have no easy answers. The broader impact on American society and politics cannot be overstated. The Vietnam War, and Rolling Thunder as a major component of it, shattered the post-World War II consensus on American foreign policy. It created deep divisions that persist today. It led to profound distrust of government, of military and political leaders, of the media. It spawned a massive anti-war movement that changed American culture. It contributed to inflation, to social unrest, to political instability. The war helped end Johnson's presidency. It contributed to the rise of Richard Nixon. The wounds it opened in American society have never fully healed. From a purely military perspective, Rolling Thunder is a case study in how not to conduct an air campaign. Every principle of war, mass, maneuver, objective, simplicity, unity of command, economy of force was violated. The campaign lacked mass because it was spread out over years with pauses and restrictions. It lacked clear objectives because the goals kept shifting. It lacked simplicity because the rules of engagement were Byzantine. It lacked unity of command because Washington micromanaged the tactical details. It lacked economy of force because enormous resources were expended for minimal strategic gain. The campaign violated the principle of surprise by signaling intentions and operating on predictable patterns. It violated the principle of security by allowing sanctuaries and failing to protect the most vital South Vietnamese assets. Yet despite all these failures, despite the enormous cost in lives and treasure, despite the ultimate defeat, there were moments of incredible heroism and skill. Pilots like Robin Olds, who led his men with courage and cunning, who shot down MiGs and inspired confidence. POWs like James Stockdale and John McCain, who resisted torture and maintained honor in the worst circumstances imaginable. Rescue crews who flew into hostile territory to save downed pilots. Maintainers who kept aircraft flying under primitive conditions. Ordinary men who did extraordinary things in service to their country, even when that service was in a cause that was flawed. Looking back more than 50 years later, it is easy to judge the decisions made during Rolling Thunder. It is easy to see the mistakes, the hubris, the miscalculations. But the people making those decisions believed they were doing the right thing. They believed that stopping communist expansion was essential to American security and to freedom worldwide. They believed that American power could be applied precisely and effectively to achieve political goals. They believed that a poor backward nation could not withstand American military might. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, but their intentions were not evil. The question that haunts historians is whether Rolling Thunder could have succeeded under different circumstances. If Johnson had authorized unrestricted bombing from the start, mining Haiphong harbor, destroying the dikes, bombing downtown Hanoi, invading the north, would it have worked? Perhaps in a narrow tactical sense, North Vietnam might have been forced to negotiate sooner. But at what cost? Chinese intervention was a real possibility. Massive civilian casualties would have further eroded international support. And even if North Vietnam had been bombed into rubble, the insurgency in South Vietnam would have continued because it had deep roots in South Vietnamese society. The fundamental problem was not insufficient bombing of the North. It was that South Vietnam was not a viable state, and the Viet Cong insurgency had genuine popular support in many areas. Another counterfactual is whether America should have stayed out of Vietnam entirely. With hindsight, many historians argue that Vietnam was not essential to American security, that the domino theory was wrong, that Southeast Asia would not have fallen to communism even if Vietnam had been unified under a communist government. But this was not clear in the 1960s. The Cold War was real. The threat of communist expansion was real. The memory of appeasing Hitler, of allowing aggression to go unchecked, was fresh. American leaders felt they had to act. The tragedy is that they acted in ways that were counterproductive. The North Vietnamese response to Rolling Thunder deserves more attention. They showed remarkable resilience and adaptability. The leadership in Hanoi never wavered in their commitment to reunifying the country. Ho Chi Minh and his successors were willing to accept enormous casualties and hardship to achieve their goals. They understood that time was on their side, that America's will was not infinite, that domestic pressure in America would eventually force withdrawal. They used every bombing pause to rebuild and prepare. They distributed industry and supplies widely to minimize damage from bombing. They built underground facilities and used caves for storage. They mobilized the entire population for civil defense. Children dug air raid shelters. Women operated anti-aircraft guns. Everyone participated in the war effort. The North Vietnamese also waged a sophisticated political and diplomatic campaign. They invited foreign journalists to witness bomb damage. They released carefully selected POWs to generate sympathy. They negotiated in Paris while continuing to fight in Vietnam. They portrayed America as a bullying superpower attacking a small, poor nation. This narrative resonated internationally. It strengthened the anti-war movement in America. It put Johnson and later Nixon on the defensive diplomatically. The North Vietnamese also received crucial support from their allies. China provided safe haven, massive military aid, and even personnel. At one point, more than 300,000 Chinese troops were in North Vietnam, mostly operating anti-aircraft defenses and logistics, freeing North Vietnamese forces for combat in the south. The Soviet Union provided sophisticated weapons, SAMs, MiGs, radar systems, and training. This aid was essential. Without it, North Vietnam could not have sustained the war. But Rolling Thunder could not stop this aid because the sources, the shipments through China and the port of Haiphong, were off limits. In the end, Operation Rolling Thunder stands as one of the great failures of American military power. It demonstrated that overwhelming force does not guarantee victory, that technology cannot substitute for strategy, that airpower alone cannot win wars, that political constraints can negate military advantages, that a determined enemy fighting on home ground is extraordinarily difficult to defeat. These lessons were hard-won, paid for in blood and treasure, learned at enormous cost. The human cost is what matters most. More than 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. Millions of Vietnamese died, north and south, military and civilian. Entire societies were traumatized. Families were destroyed. Futures were stolen, all for a war that accomplished nothing, that ended with the outcome America fought to prevent. The tragedy is not just that America lost. The tragedy is that the war was fought at all, that so many died for so little, that the suffering was so vast and the gains so negligible. Today, Vietnam is unified under communist rule, just as North Vietnam always intended. But it is not the domino that topples Southeast Asia into communism. Thailand remains non-communist. Malaysia remains non-communist. Indonesia remains non-communist. The domino theory was wrong. Vietnam today is integrated into the global economy. It has diplomatic relations with America. American tourists visit. American companies invest. The war that seemed so urgent in the 1960s seems pointless in hindsight. This is the ultimate verdict on Operation Rolling Thunder. It was a massive effort that achieved nothing lasting except pain and death and division. The bombs fell like thunder, shaking the earth, filling the sky with fire and smoke. But when the thunder stopped, when the smoke cleared, when the last aircraft turned for home, nothing fundamental had changed, except that thousands more people were dead, and America had learned a hard lesson about the limits of its power.